For budget e-bikes, most problems don't show up during the first review. They appear weeks or even months later. That's why we kept riding the Actbest Mars long. 6 months later, we've got a much clearer picture of what this bike is really like to own. Some things impressed us even more than before, while others reminded us exactly why it's still a budget e-bike. So instead of going over the specs again, today we're sharing our real experience after 6 months of riding. Let's begin. The first thing we noticed is that the Mars doesn't really feel like a 6-month-old budget e-bike. Visually, it still looks clean. And the frame has held up much better than we originally expected. The paint has survived quite well. The folding mechanism was something we were slightly worried about in the beginning, because moving parts usually become loose over time. Thankfully, that hasn't really happened. It still folds and unfolds smoothly, although the hinge doesn't feel quite as tight as it did on day one. That's completely normal after regular use. We also expected ourselves to use the folding feature only once in a while, but we've been folding it much more often than we thought. Whether it's fitting it into the trunk, carrying it inside during bad weather, or storing it in a small corner of the apartment, that's one feature we've genuinely appreciated over these last 6 months. Now let's talk about the frame. Well, the good news is, even after months of riding over cracked roads, speed bumps, and occasional gravel trails, we haven't noticed any cracks, unusual flexing, or anything that made us question its structural strength. One thing we do recommend is keeping the folding latch clean. Dust and tiny bits of dirt can slowly build up around the hinge if you're riding on gravel or dusty roads. A quick wipe and a little lubricant every once in a while keeps everything operating smoothly. The all-terrain tires have also helped protect the frame more than we expected. Because they absorb a decent amount of vibration, the bike doesn't take as much impact from rough surfaces. When we first reviewed the Mars, the 1000-watt rear hub motor sounded like one of its biggest selling points. After 6 months, we can finally say whether that power actually lasts in real-world riding. The answer is mostly yes. The motor still feels lively whenever you pull away from a stop. Acceleration isn't as exciting as it felt on the very first day, mostly because we've simply gotten used to it, but the performance itself hasn't noticeably dropped. It still climbs moderate hills confidently, keeps up with traffic in bike lanes, and reaches its higher speeds without feeling like it's struggling. Now, it's not completely perfect. On very long uphill climbs, especially during hot afternoons, you can tell the motor is working hard. It never overheated during our testing, but you can feel the power delivery soften slightly until things cool back down. For normal commuting though, this wasn't something we experienced often enough to become an issue. Another positive is that the motor has remained quiet. Even after months of use, we haven't heard any unusual noises, rattles, or vibrations coming from the rear hub, which is always reassuring on a budget e-bike. Battery performance is probably the biggest question people ask after owning an e-bike for several months. And honestly, we were curious ourselves. After 6 months, we've noticed a very small reduction, but nothing dramatic. Depending on how aggressively we ride, we're still getting enough range for several days of normal commuting before needing another charge. Most of our riding has been a mix of pedal assist levels 2 and 3, with occasional bursts into the higher modes when we wanted a little extra speed. Using it that way, the battery has remained very dependable. One thing we did learn over time is that temperature affects the battery more than we initially realized. On cooler mornings, the range feels slightly better, while extremely hot days seem to reduce it just a little. That's fairly common with lithium batteries, so it wasn't something we found surprising. Okay, this is probably where we've noticed the biggest difference. The tires have actually held up better than we expected. The tread is definitely more worn than it was in our first review, especially on the rear tire since that's where all the power goes. But there's still plenty of grip left for everyday riding. On pavement, they continue to feel stable, and on gravel paths, they still inspire enough confidence. The mechanical disc brakes also needed a little attention over time. During the first few months, they worked exactly as expected, but eventually we found ourselves adjusting the brake cable slightly to keep that nice, firm braking feel. That's pretty normal for mechanical brakes, and once adjusted, they continued to stop the bike confidently. The front suspension hasn't changed much either. It's still on the firmer side, just like we mentioned in our first review, so don't expect it to soak up every bump like an expensive mountain bike. But for broken pavement, speed bumps, and everyday city riding, it still does exactly what it's supposed to do. In fact, after months of use, we've come to appreciate that firmer setup because it doesn't feel overly bouncy. The drivetrain has been another pleasant surprise. The Shimano 7-speed gears continue to shift smoothly, although we did make a small adjustment to the derailleur after a few months because the indexing had drifted just a little. Also, the saddle has softened up slightly over time, making longer rides a bit more comfortable than when it was brand new. The grips have also held their shape well, and even after months of regular riding, they still feel comfortable without becoming sticky or slippery. If you're buying your very first e-bike, this is honestly one of the easiest bikes to recommend. It's simple to ride, doesn't feel intimidating, and the controls are straightforward enough that you can get comfortable within just a few minutes. It's also a great option for commuters who don't have a lot of storage space. Weekend riders will probably enjoy it as well. While we still wouldn't call it a true mountain bike, it handles gravel paths, park trails, and light off-road riding surprisingly well. As long as your expectations are realistic, it's more capable than its price might suggest. On the other hand, if you're planning to ride aggressive mountain trails every weekend or carry heavy cargo every single day, you may eventually want something built for those specific jobs. Mars can certainly handle occasional rough terrain, but that's not really what it was designed to do. Looking back at our first review and comparing it with 6 months of real ownership, we can honestly say the Actbest Mars has exceeded most of our expectations. When we first saw the price, we assumed we'd have to accept a lot of compromises. Instead, what we found was an e-bike that has remained dependable, enjoyable to ride, and surprisingly durable through everyday use. Sure, we've tightened a few bolts, adjusted the brakes once or twice, and noticed a little normal wear, but none of those things felt out of place. In fact, they're exactly the kind of maintenance we'd expect from almost any regularly used bicycle. So after 6 months, would we still recommend the Actbest Mars? Absolutely. If you're looking for an affordable folding e-bike that's practical, fun to ride, and has proven itself over months of real-world use, the Mars is still one of the strongest value options we've tested. It may not have every premium feature, but it gets the important things right, and sometimes that's exactly what matters most. If you've been riding one yourself, we'd love to hear how your experience has been over the past few months. Let us know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next review.